Play with the context a bit and see what happens. First, something simple. What if the speaker pointed to the rabbit as it hopped by? That would sure help eliminate a bunch of possibilities. But what if the linguist didn't see where the speaker was pointing? What if she was looking up at a bird singing in a tree when she heard Gavagai? From that perspective, she'd think it had something to do with the bird, not the rabbit. Sharing attention on the same object was assumed in Quine's example, but in the messy real world, you can't take that for granted, especially with children. Or suppose you knew more about why the two people were walking on the path. What if the Arunta speaker was thinking about dinner that night, but the linguist believed that they were just taking a walk? In that case, Gavagai might mean for the speaker, let's catch that, but for the listener, it could mean, that's a rabbit. And for you fans of Monty Python's Holy Grail, what if, unbeknownst to the linguist, the animal that sprang from the vegetation was a very dangerous creature in Arunta? In that case, Gavagai could be a dire warning. But how would the linguist know that? These puzzles get at the heart of why the pragmatics of language are so important. Without understanding the richness of social intentions, motivations, and context, there's no hope for successful communication. In this lecture, we'll talk about what young children know and learn about their social world and how they use that information to navigate the endless ambiguities of language. Humans come into the world naturally drawn to other people. From the first day of life, babies prefer their mother's voice to a stranger's voice, and a stranger's voice to other sounds in the environment. Even if these preferences are learned to some extent in the womb, they suggest a readiness to listen to human speech at birth. Beyond speech, did you know that babies are born visually attracted to other humans? Show newborns a picture of a human face and a regular old object, and they'll look longer at the face. Findings like this were originally taken as evidence that baby brains are built specifically for processing human faces, but we now know that it may be a more general inclination. For example, babies are drawn more broadly to objects that are symmetrical from side to side, but asymmetrical from top to bottom, just like a face. Not only that, they also show a preference for monkey faces, not just faces of humans. There's still debate about how specific or general this innate preference is, but either way, the upshot is that newborns come into the world primed to attend to faces. Here's another innate predisposition that draws babies towards humans. Have you ever heard of a point light display? It's created by attaching light sensors on parts of moving objects and then making a video of the sensors. If the movement is novel, the resulting video is really hard to understand, but if it's familiar, it's quite easy to recognize. The biological motion of walking is one of the most easily recognizable point light displays of human action. When you see it right side up, it just pops out at you. Same for newborns. Francesca Simeon and colleagues at the University of Padua have shown that 2-day-old babies prefer to look at upright point light displays of humans walking more than inverted ones. So it's not just random movements that newborns are attracted to, it's specifically movements that are biologically meaningful. Once a baby locks into its fellow human, it starts singling out particular behaviors that give it clues about what makes other people tick. One behavior that seems to fascinate babies is what people do with their eyes. Research has shown that even as young as 2 days old, babies will look longer at a picture of a face that's looking straight at them versus one that's with the eyes averted to the side. This gaze locking seems to be doing something special for babies, just as it does for adults. It's been known for a while that when two people make eye contact, there's a phenomenon known as pupillary contagion. Pupils get larger or dilate when someone is interested in something or attracted to something. And pupil contagion is when the dilation of pupils in one person influences the dilation in another. The interesting thing is that mimicking another person's pupil size is correlated with increased feelings of arousal, trust, and cooperation. Not only that, it seems to activate brain networks involved in perspective taking, and specifically a skill called theory of mind, which we'll talk about in a bit. Christine Fawcett and her team at the University of Uppsala in Sweden have demonstrated this same sort of mimicry in very young infants. In one study, 4-month-olds viewed pictures of eyes with different sized pupils, and then the pupil sizes of the infants were measured with a device called an eye tracker, which is just a special camera that can determine where people are looking and how much their pupils dilate. The main finding was that even 4-month-olds engage in this pupillary mimicry, leading the researchers to conclude that this shared state of arousal could be an early mechanism for the development of social skills like empathy and group coordination. This hypothesis receives support from some fascinating research on slightly older infants done by Victoria Leong and colleagues at the University of Cambridge. The team had an adult sing a nursery rhyme to an 8-month-old baby while measuring neural synchrony with an electroencephalogram, or EEG. While singing the nursery rhyme, the adult either looked directly at the baby or averted her gaze slightly to the side. The key finding was that the brainwaves of the adult and infant were much more in sync with one another when there was direct eye contact versus no eye contact. Not only that, this synchrony was correlated with how much a baby communicated to the adult through vocalizations. The greater the neural synchrony, the more the babies vocalized. We'll get into the technical details of EEG in a later lecture, but for the time being, I hope you can appreciate the significance of this finding. It means that babies and adults use eye gaze to link up their brains, and one function of this may be to create a joint neural state that is optimized for exchanging social information during early communication and learning. It's as if making eye contact can plug one mind into another. This high-tech experiment fits very nicely with some classic research done in the 1970s by the great developmental psychologist Jerome Bruner. Using cutting-edge technology of his time, Bruner analyzed videotapes of 9-month-olds spontaneously interacting with caregivers in their homes. He was looking for social behaviors that could be signs that babies were learning about the goals, motivations, and intentions of adults. Bruner made many interesting observations, but the one that links up best with this language learning is a behavior dubbed joint attention. This joint attention refers to how babies seemed especially interested in sharing visual focus on objects with adults. Now, this wasn't just a matter of a baby and an adult simply looking at the same thing. That's pretty ordinary. Bruner's joint attention was different. He argued that not only are babies and adults looking at the same thing, they mutually know that they're both looking at the same thing. This comes back to knowing about knowing, which, as we discussed, seems to be a uniquely human skill. Given that joint attention emerges just before children start speaking, it likely serves as a mechanism for early word learning. Here's how it might work. When an infant and adult mutually know that they are looking at the same object, the infant infers that any word that the adult says must refer to the thing they're both looking at. It's as if the child and adult have some sort of tacit agreement that labeling objects always happens in the social context of joint attention. If so, this would be very helpful for cutting through some of the Quinean ambiguities of what words refer to. Given that infants hear literally thousands of words every day, having a social mechanism that links some of those words to particular objects in the environment greatly simplifies the learning task. So what's the evidence that infants use joint attention to actually learn words? In one of the first systematic attempts to explore this question, Dare Baldwin, a developmental psychologist at the University of Oregon, did a series of studies on children in the throes of early word learning. In one study, Baldwin was interested in whether 18-month-olds would learn a name for a toy if there was no joint attention with an adult. The children were placed in a room with very few novel toys in it. Crucially, there were toys that the children had never seen, so there's no way the child could have known the names for them. When they started playing with the toy that interested them, an experimenter labeled it by saying, "Donu, there's a Donu." This labeling occurred in two different conditions. In one condition, the experimenter was right next to the child looking directly at the toy. In the other condition, the experimenter was next to the child but sitting on the other side of an opaque screen so that the child couldn't see where the experimenter was looking. In both cases, the child heard the exact same speech. The only difference was in one case, the child and the adult shared joint attention, and in the other case, they did not. The main finding was that when there was joint attention, children frequently mapped the word Danu onto the object they were playing with. But when there was no joint attention, children did not reliably learn the new word. This learning happens in much more ambiguous situations too. Picture a table with two novel toys, one on either end. Baldwin had an experimenter play with an 18-month-old such that one of the two toys was the focus of joint attention. Just at that point, the experimenter said, "It's a Modi." In one condition, the Modi was said while looking at the toy that they were already playing with. But in a different condition, Modi was uttered while the adult looked at the second toy at the other end of the table. In both cases, the child took note of where the adult was looking. And guess what? When tested later for what Modi meant, the child attached the word to the object the adult was looking at, even in the condition where they were both playing with one toy, but the adult was looking at the other toy at the other end of the table. In other words, children used an adult's eye gaze to flexibly shift joint attention to one place to the next during ambiguous situations. These are important findings because they suggest that little language learners are not passively and egocentrically linking words to objects. Instead, they are actively looking for good social reasons to connect a word to a referent, and they learn early on that appealing to the nonverbal intentions of a speaker is an extremely helpful guide. Eye gaze isn't the only useful nonverbal tool in the word learning process. As we discussed earlier, hand gestures also play a huge role. As you know, infants and adults communicate with hand gestures well before they start communicating with words. Pointing gestures in particular are especially prominent. Recall that babies point not just to get things they want, but also to comment on things and inform people about them. For example, Ulf Laskowski and his colleagues have done a series of experiments with 1-year-olds showing that they produce gestures to serve both of these functions, to comment and inform. In one study, an infant and an experimenter were in a room with various objects. When one of these objects became salient, like a light blinking and making a sound, the infant almost always pointed to it and made eye contact with the adult,